Another suicide bomber targeted Shiite pilgrims in Baghdad on Thursday. At least 14 people died. Now, despite the violence, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims continue to make the trip to Karbala to mark one of the main holy days on the Shiite calendar. Dozens of other pilgrims have been killed this week in similar attacks. The continued violence in Iraq brings us to today's insight. This week marks 2 weeks since the U.S. troops withdrew completely from Iraq. It was a controversial war from the start, an invasion based on faulty intelligence, followed by a bloody insurgency, and now the chaos of sectarian war. CCTV's Malini Wilkes begins our insight from Washington.
These are the defining images from 2013 in Iraq. The wreckage of a bombed-out car, rivers of blood, oceans of grief. The group Iraq Body Count puts the civilian death toll for 2013 at 9,000 by mid-December, the highest level since 2008, though still far below the numbers from the previous 2 years at the height of the Sunni versus Shia sectarian warfare. James Jeffrey was U.S. ambassador to Iraq from 2010 to 2012.
What we're seeing is a rise in violence almost completely caused by the growth of al-Qaeda, spurred by two new developments. Development number one is, and most importantly, the situation in Syria.
With the conflict raging across the border, the Iraqi faction of al-Qaeda has allied itself with its radical Sunni counterpart in Syria, expanding its reach. The second development is the increasing dissatisfaction of Iraq's Sunni minority. They have long complained that the Shia-led government has marginalized them and targeted them for arrest. The flashpoint came in April, when Iraqi security forces conducted a deadly raid on a Sunni protest camp in Hawija, a town north of Baghdad. Al-Qaeda responded with a relentless campaign of bombings across the country, targeting both Shias and other Sunnis believed to be cooperating with the government. It was 2 years ago this week when U.S. troops withdrew from Iraq after nearly 9 years of war. At that time, al-Qaeda's influence had been greatly diminished.
They did not have the freedom of maneuver. They were very much, even though they were dangerous, they were a shell of their former selves.
U.S. Army Major General Jeffrey Buchanan was the chief military spokesman as the Americans left in 2011. Even then, he says, there were concerns about the Iraqi security forces' ability to defend the country.
They had some significant gaps that we all recognized, they recognized.
But the U.S. failed to reach a deal with Iraq to allow American troops to remain in the country. The U.S. Embassy was left with the task of providing counterterrorism support to Iraq, and it struggled to muster the necessary manpower and resources from Washington.
Finding the money, finding the legal authorities, finding the legal justification to keep those people in country, getting the clearance from the Iraqi government. We were able to do some of that, but far less than we thought we would, because that's what happens when you don't have military forces in country. And the lesson there is, don't forget that in Afghanistan.
But Manal Omar of the U.S. Institute for Peace is among those who question the need for extending the American presence in Iraq.
I always questioned how much are we preventing a bloodbath and how much are we preventing reconciliation? Because the reality is, with U.S. troops, with international community so involved in Iraq, it was an artificial balance of power. Despite
the spike in violence this year, Iraq has not seen a return to the daily revenge killings carried out by the sectarian death squads of 2006 and 2007.
Yes, there are rising levels of violence. But I also think that it is too early right now to judge whether or not it was all worth it. I really think we need 5 or 10 years.
Currently, only a small contingent of a few hundred American troops remain in Iraq, working under the umbrella of the U.S. Embassy. And their main task is assisting with the sale of U.S. military equipment to Iraq. Malini Wilkes, CCTV, Washington.